computer. Okay. Oh, hey, we've got Marilyn there. My apologies, my video is not working.
No worries, Marilyn. All good.
We'll get you going. I think we're just waiting for Olivia from Rapsy Griffiths down the bottom. Okay, all righty. Let's get into it. Okay, just confirming, can everyone see that screen share I've got going? Yep, okay, great. So welcome everyone to the first Community of Risk Management event for 2021. So stoked to have you all back and thank you for joining us. Just a quick refresher on the intent is that, look, this space evolved out of the COVID pandemic, initially as a gathering of people in the mining and rail space to come together with not-for-profit entities, but it's evolved to be so much more than that. And over the course of 2020, for any of us that joined previous discussions, we shared all sorts of exciting and interesting meetings with different guests and some great technical topics. So I'll share this deck with everybody that's on the call, but that was just a little infographic, just kind of bringing together what we decided were the best parts of 2020. And so quick bit of house rules. So look, this is a safe space. Chatham House rules or Chatham House rules do apply. So, you know, speak freely, but don't take it out of the room. Keep everything constructive and positive. Please feel free to connect with each other outside of this forum. That's the whole basis of it, you know, chat with each other. While we've got the technical side going, just keep your mics on mute and drop your questions in the Q&A at the end. And so that's our agenda for today. We're just going to launch straight into it. And what I'll do is start with that before I introduce our guests. So the Tinfoil Hat Brigade. This issue, more than anything you're probably going to encounter over the course of 2021, is going to find the Tinfoil Hat Brigade in your workforce. You know, over the course of 2020, we had medical advice provided by rugby league players. We had medical advice provided by celebrity chefs, Instagram influencers, and everyone in between. So this issue around the COVID-19 vaccine is going to bring out some very interesting types in your organisation, and be very prepared for that. And today we'll address how we can constructively respond to that using risk management. So what I'll do is I'll cut that screen share and I'll just very briefly introduce our guests that we've got in the room with us today. If that's is that gonna work for us? Have I somehow killed it, Chris?
Not too sure.
Yeah, okay, hang on. Are we still coming? Click to exit. There we go. Sorry, guys. Momentary lapse of.
James is just getting up to date with his technology.
Yeah, I had to do an update.
This is what happens when someone wears a tinfoil hat.
That's exactly right. So look, what we'll do is just a quick shout out. We're going to go to them for technical questions at the end. So today, obviously, Bronwyn and myself are in the room. We're also joined by Chris McCourt. So if you can give us a wave, Chris.
Hi, everyone.
Yep, Jennifer Parks.
Hello, everyone.
And Warwick Ryan up the back. So three very senior and skilled solicitors who can answer all the very tough questions that Bronwyn and I either don't know how to answer or don't want to answer. So that's
we're not going to incriminate ourselves, but
yeah.
They're lawyers.
Yeah, so what we'll do is we'll move straight into it, and we're going to go through the technical aspects to begin with, and then we're going to cover off on the legal side with the team behind me. So Bronwyn, I think it's over to you.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for that, James. So everyone has the paper that we have pre-circulated on this particular topic, but today's topic is about risk aspects of rolling out the COVID vaccine and the impacts on your workplace. So we've taken a principles approach to this particular risk and this topic. And so we're going to be going through the three principles. Principle 1 being risk assessment, principle 2 being consultation, and principle 3 being documented systems that are implemented and monitored. So we're going to go through that with you today. We're going to touch on each of the categories of risk. So these are detailed in your paper to give you more background. So we're going to just touch on them briefly as we make our way through. What we wanted to do was touch on that, go to the legal aspects, but then give you plenty of time for questions. We think that this is is something that will pose and bring forward a lot of questions as it relates to the vaccine, whether or not you can mandate it in your workplace and what it might mean for you. So as James said earlier, please feel free to drop your questions into the chat box. So first up, the first principle that we have covered off is that of risk assessment. So with all workplace hazards, the contemporary approach is to undertake a risk assessment. So this is going to help you identify your hazards, your risk controls, but it's going to give you a defensible position in relation to the decisions you're making as it relates to the COVID vaccine rollout. Undertaking a risk assessment of the rollout is advice that is supported by a few pieces of really important documentation that's come out recently. So taking a risk managed approach is supported by the new ISO standard that was launched in December 2020. That's ISO PAS 45005, working safely in a COVID environment. Safe Work Australia and their guidance material also recommend taking a risk managed approach, as do our state-based safety regulators and our industry regulators, such as the New South Wales Resources Regulator and others. So when you're doing your risk assessment, you should consider the size and the complexity of your organisation, and you should undertake your risk assessment using a recognised methodology. So if you have access to the standard AS 31010, that's called risk assessment techniques. That'll give you a lot of models that you can use and apply to undertake your risk assessment. James and I have been working with the bow tie method with a lot of organisations, and we find that that method works really well, but we've also had success with scenario analysis and what if modelling. So there's a few things you can do, and you can choose the method that works for you. But undertaking a risk assessment, so that'll be really important. So then if we start to think about what categories of risk should you include in your risk assessment, I'll start first with the human resources risk, which also includes industrial relations risk. So here you should be thinking about employment contracts and any enterprise bargaining or enterprise development agreements that are in place in your workplace. So some professions do have clauses in their contracts that mandate certain vaccines. Okay? So this might be important to you in terms of depending what industry you're in, that could be relevant to you. But you should now broaden your thinking to also start to give consideration to your workers that may need to travel domestically or internationally. So think about what a vaccine and a vaccine program might mean to them and how this might impact you and your workers. So you need to think about what impacts not having a vaccine might do for your workers, and can they still undertake the inherent requirements of their role. So giving consideration to human resource and industrial relations risk will be important. The next risk you should consider, and probably the most self-evident, is that of workplace health and safety. This has been the primary focus of all organisations as we've navigated COVID and now as we continue to navigate the vaccine rollout. But consider both the physical and psychological safety and give considerations to risk controls where you will have workers that will be vaccinated at different times. So at different stages in the rollout, workers will be vaccinated on a rolling basis. So you will need to manage workplace health and safety where you will have incidents where, or situations where you will have workers where some will be vaccinated and some will not. So you need to think about that. And then you must also consider diversity, discrimination and inclusion risk. So here you need to consider workers with either medical, disability conditions or religious beliefs that could prevent them from being vaccinated. You would be expected to make reasonable adjustments to accommodate these workers, as you would with any workplace event. So when you are thinking about the vaccine rollout in your workplace, you must also consider diversity, discrimination and inclusion risk.
Okay, that's fine. So look, moving on and just looping back on that point, particularly for our colleagues and friends out there in, let's say, the non-mining or rail sectors, don't be afraid to look at alternate methods of risk assessment. So don't be constrained by this assumption that you can only look at risk assessment in that sort of word table left to right type fashion. As Bronwyn said, in all the guidebooks and the standards that sit behind ISO 31000, there's more than 37 recognised methods of risk assessment. Some of them are very quantitative focused, so they would only apply to a financial or a banking sense. Some of them are purely qualitative, so they're literally structured brainstorming. So don't be afraid if you're a small organisation or if that's not a fit for purpose technique for you. Structured brainstorming, SWOT analysis, as we said, what if or scenario analysis are also thoroughly and entirely valid mechanisms that you can use to document your risk assessment as per Principle 1. And the point being that a good risk assessment is one that's documented. So if you're not documenting it, then really what are you doing in the first place? So just keep that in mind. So moving on, being the theme that we're running with that, think more broadly than work health and safety risk, you also should consider insurance-related risk, as Bron touched on, in terms of whether or not you've got workers moving between even state-based borders. And as a result, what the implications could be in terms of both work health and safety and broader insurance arrangements if those workers were to be caught in these sudden, let's call it, roll the shutters up style quarantine or state border closure events. I think we'll let Chris and the guys from Hickson's comment on this in a more detailed fashion later, but the rule with insurance is you want to get in there and you want to talk to your insurance brokers or your insurance agencies early, not late. You don't want to have to look at chatting to them retrospectively, get in and get them involved now. And I think, as Bron said earlier, get them with a seat at the table, potentially even with your risk assessment that you're considering. So then moving on from that, you've got obviously privacy. And if you're a not-for-profit or a disability or an entity that controls or handles medical records, we don't need to tell you about that in detail. You've got some very specific standards that you must meet around managing that privacy risk and obviously managing the outcomes of any sort of data breach event in terms of the notifiable data breach scheme. We're not going to cover that here. And then financially, this stuff is going to cost money. I think as all effectively representatives of employers here, nothing comes free. There is no such thing as a free lunch. And when it comes to this event, no doubt, as usual, what the government can't do, the business community will have to pick up the deficit on. So be prepared to be going now to board or senior managers to be looking at getting budgets allocated in ready provision for this event and for this risk-based process. Then probably most importantly with this, reputational risk, because coming back to the old tinfoil hat special, there is a lot, we are being sort of, tongue-in-cheek because we like to have a joke, but at the end of the day, there is going to be reams, and there already is reams of unqualified dribble out there on social media, and certain people from, everybody's second cousin who's an influencer through to Pete Evans and the like and the rest that are espousing what they would regard as medical advice. And surprise, surprise, Warwick will cover this. Pretty sure that most rugby league players aren't qualified medical professionals last time I checked. So there needs to be an understanding that internal workplace policies, and Warwick and the Hickson's guys will cover this in detail, will or may need to be updated in order to prevent adverse reputational impact on the business as a result of, look, let's be, call it what it is here, people running their mouth within your organisation or jumping on either work or personal social platforms and loudly either supporting or denigrating the organisation's position in relation to the COVID vaccine. So you need to incorporate that into your risk assessment. So Bron, back to you.
Okay, cool. So principle number 2 in the discussion paper is that of consultation. And we know that consultation is a really important aspect that underpins risk management, workplace health and safety, and every other risk category. So it's going to be really important that you make sure that you have a really strong consultation program in place for this, supported by communication, and that you understand early who are your stakeholders in this. Okay, so you need to understand who needs a seat at the table on this one. This might be consulting more broadly than beyond the groups you would normally consult with. Normally, consultation would be undertaken with your workers, management, your worker representatives. It could be your unions and it could be your contractors. Okay, so they're all important stakeholders for you to make sure that you've got a consultation program in place with, okay? But you need to think a little bit more broadly. Here, we're also suggesting that it's your legal teams, your insurance provider, your labour hire, and anybody else interacting with your business. Anybody where there may be a risk of transmission of COVID is really going to be a stakeholder here, and you need to make sure that you've identified who they are and that you've got your consultation program decided and formalised. So it's interesting to note that this is supported by all the relevant standards, but in particular, the new standard we referred to earlier, ISO PAS 45005, the international standard, okay, that also incorporates consultation. Because it's an international standard, they refer to it as inclusion or inclusivity, and that's chapter 7 of that standard. There's a whole chapter on consultation in that new international standard. Okay, but having a consultation and communication program is not only compliance, but it's important to the success of your program.
Excellent. Okay, thanks, Bron. So the third principle is documented systems that are actually implemented and followed. And I think we presented this discussion paper to the Mine Managers Association late last week. We said the same thing to them as we'll say to you guys. It might feel like we're stating the bleedingly obvious here, but you need to obviously understand that you don't write things down that you're not going to be able to do or you're not going to be able to meet in terms of benchmarks, compliance. So in other words, if you're not doing it, don't write it down. And if you write it down, you need to be able to live those values as a organisation. If you're unable to live that or meet that standard, then we strongly encourage you to reconsider the way that that's worded. Again, this will be something that Chris and the Hickson's guys will take us through in a little bit more detail briefly. But the second factor with that in this principle 3 that we want to emphasise is that, look, you know, we all know we're pretty smart people in this room. Chances are we're in a C-suite role, or we might even be the CEO, or we're on a board.
Some of us are smarter than others. But
Yeah, that's right. I know what this operation is. Yeah. But
We're just comfortable with where we sit, mate.
But look, at the end of the day, plain English is so important. Like, there was a period, particularly, I'm speaking to the mining guys here, where it was almost like more words equals more protection in a mining safety management system. We're going the other way now. So less words, make them count, use plain English. We don't need legalese, save it for the lawyers. Okay, so your processes around this as well need to be written in a way that your workforce can understand. So that means if you're doing frontline support work in the disability sector, those workers need to understand it. If you're maintaining rail track, CAT, your workers at that frontline need to understand it. So please make sure that those systems are documented in plain English, that they are reflective of the organisation's ability to respond, so the benchmarks it can meet, and then also importantly that they're linked to other relevant broader governance arrangements within the organisation. So they need to align to risk appetite statements, they need to align to risk matrices, any other broader organisational governance arrangements that are in place. So look, Bron, I'll hand back to you on that.
Okay, thank you. So in terms of all the various risk categories that we've just covered, that's a lot of information in there. But what we really wanted to do was also give you an action plan. So something that you could effectively take and use in your call to action to ensure that you can get the processes underway in your business. So you will have noted in the at the back of the paper, we've actually given you a checklist there that you can work with. So that's going to help you understand who your stakeholders are. It's actually going to help you form up an action plan for your business on how you can start to manage these risks and how you can make sure that you've got an effective program in place. Okay, so there's your action steps as opposed to just a whole load of advice. We wanted to give you a takeaway.
So what we can do this, Chris. This is a fun space. What did we say? The 3 principles.
Which is going.
Okay. Sorry, that was bad. The 3 principles in the discussion paper really come together into that action plan. So we'd encourage you to take the time to really think seriously about those 3 principles, and you've got that recipe for success there at the back as it comes together as the steps to success. So look, what we might do now is, given that the bulk of the questions may well be in this space in terms of legal and compliance, what I'd like to do is hand over to Chris and Jen and Warwick at Hixson's, and they're going to cover off on the legal context, and then also particularly, I think we're keen to hear about relevant mandating of vaccine, let's call it related case law or commission law. So Chris, I'll hand the floor to you and we'll keep moving.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. Just a real quick one. It's Christine from ARTC.
Oh, hey, Christine. Yep, go for it.
Can you just very briefly go over I've been sort of jotting all the bits and pieces down. I'm very interested in the section in the risk section of insurance.
Yep.
Can we just expand on that a little bit, please?
Yeah.
Because we do have a lot of people crossing borders and
okay. Look, Christine, just because I know we're tight on time, what we might do is I'll hand to Chris, and then we'll make that the first item to loop back to at the end prior to going to open Q&A. Because of course, we want to make sure you get that. Get that context. So thank you.
Just made a note of that, Justine. So we'll go to that first.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. All right, take it away, Chris.
All right, thanks, mate, and thank you, Christine. That's a really good question, and almost a session in itself, to be honest.
Yeah.
I think there's plenty in that. Look, the key part of this from a legal perspective at the moment, I think, really sits in the employment law space, which is why I've invited our employment law partner along, Warwick. Before we start with Warwick, though, there's a couple of things we probably just need to take off the table and I think make clear as to where the government sits with the vaccine. And the one thing that they have made abundantly clear is that it won't be mandated. So that's really going to come back to business to consider what your position is. They've taken what is the standard Australian government position on vaccination, which is we do not mandate vaccinations. It's not a compulsory thing. We are a voluntary country in that regard. The but that they put on that is, if you'd like access to our family tax benefit A or a childcare rebate, your children need to be vaccinated. So the way to consider that is that although that they're not mandating it, we may see backward ways of the government coming to enforce it upon people. And for those that listen to Gladys's every word, she's already alluded to, access to large sporting facilities, certain pubs and clubs of venue size. You may need to be vaccinated. So I don't think we'll hear too much more from that space until we see the larger scale rollout of the vaccine. But it is something to watch this space on as to what the government will do to quasi-mandate the vaccination. The other thing which Bron touched on, and it doesn't quite answer your question, Christine, but it does go a bit to, will vaccinations be mandatory for travel? The government in their current policy paper has said that they support it and will be running a strong campaign. They may introduce border entry or re-entry requirements that are conditional on proof of vaccination. I think this isn't a mystery for those of us that travel regularly. You do need to get vaccinated to go to certain countries. The COVID-19 vaccine will just become part of that normal big list that you take to the doctor, depending on what country you go to. I do know in the past when I've travelled through South America to get back into Canada, we all had to have a yellow fever vaccination confirmation. So those sort of things I think are going to continue. And that's the sort of thing we may see from the government once the broader community has had the rollout of the vaccine. So I think a lot of these policies, the reason we still have questions about them is because they can't really be developed until the broader community has seen the vaccine.
I think, sorry, Chris, to jump in, I think that's probably an important point to emphasise to the audience, that really where the rubber's going to hit the road in terms of this principles-based approach is exactly where Chris is saying. So if you look at the current COVID strategy in terms of vaccine rollout, if it gets to the point where the majority of the community is being vaccinated, that's when the onus will start to become really pertinent on the employer.
Exactly right.
To then work out how we navigate that, let's call it that next stage. So sorry, Chris.
Yeah, no, and you're bang on the mark there, mate. The reality of it is that the purpose of this session is to get you thinking about it and get you prepared for when that occurs. Because there's no point getting to December after the rollout has occurred and putting this in place. We really, I guess,
Front foot now.
need to be on the front foot. And if March last year showed us anything, those that were prepared really were able to take an advantage. And I can see Kath nodding her head there. So it is a very important thing to consider, the preparation for this event. I will touch on a workers' comp, because I think workers' comp sort of is a bit of an outcome of all of this. The only thing that I would like to touch on is a few stats before I hand over to Warwick from an employment law perspective, just so you're aware that the claims are coming through. As at the 19th of March in New South Wales, we had 400 workers' comp claims for COVID-19. 163 of those were exposure claims, so they're not really claims in the sense that they have been converted. They're just the Commission being made aware that there has been some exposure. 106 were where people have actually been diagnosed with COVID-19. So they may fall into the category, for those that have been in the community for a while would be aware that I flagged that there's a section of the workers' comp legislation where it states the worker is considered to having caught the disease at work if they're working in a prescribed industry. And I know that half the industries on the call here today do fall into that category. The one which is of interest and I have spoken to before is that there is 131 psychological claims. So for those that do have an interest in workers' comp, particularly around the cost and the budgets of it, psychological claims cost a lot more money than any other claim. On an average, their return to work days are about 120 versus your normal claim, which is at about 40 days. So straight away, there's some really significant increases there for businesses that you really should be aware of.
How many of those claims been accepted yet?
They've all been accepted.
Even the psychological ones? Because they normally take ages.
These are only psychological claims.
That have been accepted.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Wow.
These are only accepted claims. And the data hasn't changed from the 10th of February. So we haven't seen a new claim added to this since the 10th of February.
How many have been lodged? Do we know that?
I haven't got that information from iCare at the moment, I'm sorry.
Sorry, Chris, where if people are wanting to look to access this data, CIRA, iCare, where's the best?
There is access through the CIRA website. I will give James the link to send out at the end so you can have a look and play with the data.
Yeah.
I know everyone's interested. There is national data, Kath, and whoever else does have national teams. Unfortunately, as with all national data, there is a bit of a lag. It is only at July 2020, the national data. I'll shoot from the hip here. There was about 800 accepted claims in the national data, so that was prior to the Victorian outbreak. We did see a very similar split of claims where there was slightly more psychological claims than what there was diagnosed COVID-19 claims. That's something which I guess here we have talked about and not really a surprise to us. The concern is the cost and the impact for business that those psychological claims have on premiums, as well as, you know, what has happened in the business for that to occur too. So there's a couple of challenges we see there. Not to want to take up too much more time from Warwick, and I know there's quite a lot of questions around the employment law aspects. So I will now pass it over to Warwick for his commentary.
Sorry, just before you do that, Chris, was there anything you wanted to add in that regard, Jen, just before we move topics?
No, I think Chris has covered it off. The curiosity is naturally about a large amount of accepted claims or how many have been not accepted. But I think, as we've talked to in the paper, or Chris has talked to in the paper, there is definitely the flexibility in that legislation to pick up COVID-related claims, both as a claim as it's traditionally handled, that it has to come from a work situation and employment has to be a substantial contributing factor. So that causation question, the link between injury and employment, has to be satisfied. But certainly, and we would assume this, not knowing the full breakdown, is that the deeming provision that Chris has referred to that automatically accepts that claim is probably driving those numbers as well.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jen.
Sorry, Warwick, just before you start. Kath, noting your interest there, and I noted that Brendan started writing things down as well, so I assume there's an interest in his space, and I see the smile. So there is a defence to some of these, because in the event you are deemed liable for someone who has had the vaccine in their workspace, the challenge we have in this space is that there's no law around the COVID-19 vaccine. So what we're relying on is law in relation to Q fever and those type of issues where we have seen people vaccinated in the past. We were fortunate enough to be involved in a matter of Pond versus the Hunter New England local health area. What occurred in that matter, the lady was mandated to have to take the flu vaccine. Sorry, I got a bit caught up in my words there. So in having the flu vaccine, she then had quite an unusual side effect with a disease called transverse myelitis. So the challenge that they had there is she blamed the transverse myelitis on having had the vaccine. There was a proximity of about 6 weeks that occurred. We were able to successfully defend that on the behalf of the employer, noting that transverse myelitis is not a known side effect of the flu vaccine. There was quite a lot of expert opinion that went into defending that matter. And it was accepted by the commission that her side effect, which was not deemed to be a side effect, was just an unfortunate coincidence as opposed to a clear side effect of the vaccine. So we were lucky there where we were able to defend on the behalf of the employer the side effects coming out of that. The challenge is though, if someone does obtain a known side effect from the vaccine, and I'm really not going to say anything about blood clots here because that is yet to be proven. If someone does obtain a known side effect, that will be picked up by the workers' comp insurance policy in the event that you do mandate that your employees need to have that vaccine. There obviously is always going to be individual circumstances, so I would highly recommend getting legal advice on individual cases because there's a running disclaimer that's always there every time I open my mouth. So I do recommend that in those COVID-19 cases, particularly as it's new, particularly as we don't have too much law, you do come and see, I'll say us, I'll advertise us, let's do it. Come and see us and we can give you some advice on where it should be.
Or okay. Carol.
Or Carol.
Yeah.
So now over to Warwick. Sorry, mate.
No, that's perfect. We're bang on time. Warwick, the floor is yours.
Okay, how much time have I got?
10 minutes.
Okay, so I guess the question, the starting point always is, and believe it or not, but notwithstanding all the laws that they've introduced around the employment space and the various decisions that come down that make me choke on my food, as employers, you're still actually able to tell your employees to do something. So that's actually still a legal right. The question is, what can you tell them to do and in what circumstances? And that kind of sits behind the whole vaccination question. Chris alluded to it, and James alluded to it. This particular issue, I'm not sure whether it's going to loom up like Y2K as something we all feared has been particularly dramatic and then turned out to be very little for those of you over the age of 40. So who remember when we were wondering whether we could use an ATM on the 1st of January 2000? Was it 2001? Can't remember. 2000.
2000.
Yeah, that's right. It all turned out to be fine. I think the distinctive aspect of this particular issue is those that are there's kind of two schools who are opposed or concerns around the taking the vaccine. One is a group who are yet to be persuaded, and there's a lot of people who are genuinely sceptical about this vaccine. It's been produced in a hurry. They just want to see how things pan out. And I suspect for a lot of employers, there'll be people who say, you know what, happy to have the vaccine, just not yet. Maybe let's just see how it's going in June. And if it seems to be coming up trumps, then I'll stick the hand up for it. There's another crew who will go to their death and rather than take the vaccine, and they are a small and vocal minority, but they're not that small. I really struggle to put a number on it, but if I thought it was 5 or 10% of the population, somewhere in that space, who seem ardently opposed to taking this vaccine, and that may create some issues for employers. I think, unlike the situation that Chris identified in that case, I think 99% of the claims associated with this are going to be around issues regarding a refusal to take a vaccine, or worse, more significant, there's going to be a lot of employees who are quite evangelical in their views within a workplace. So, and I'll get to the question of mandating vaccine for employers, but where employers are seeking to roll out a program to ensure that all their staff are vaccinated for a variety of reasons, and this particular individual is in the lunchroom distributing leaflets explaining how significant it is, and how people are suffering all sorts of adverse responses or even death. So that's kind of the question and where the problems will arise is how, like almost all employment issues, how employers respond to that aberrant behaviour, and whether or not they follow established procedures, or in their frustration, they deviate from established procedures and they end up in that situation where an employee is vindicated, notwithstanding very poor behaviour because the employer didn't follow its own procedure. So, as Julie Andrews said, let's start at the very beginning. It's a very good place to start.
That's
terrible. So, anyway, so the question is, what's the lawful direction? Well, the lawful direction, as alluded to already, is your firm foundation is work health and safety. We have two pieces of information. Sorry, we don't. There are two very relevant pieces of information. One we have, one we don't yet have. Poor old Chris has heard this address about 6 times, but he's got to put up with it. He's
still smiling.
He's my employee, lawful and reasonable direction. So anyway, the first information is it effective at diminishing the risk of contracting the disease? And the evidence that is in and accepted by governments, and more particularly accepted through the TGA process in Australia, is that it is an effective agent to reduce the likelihood of an individual contracting the disease, and certainly the symptoms of the disease. So to that extent, it protects the employee. So the employer can say, because the employer has an overarching obligation, in fact, not just employers, but people conducting a business or undertaking. So people who control certain spaces like shopping centres, etc., where people come and go, they have an overarching obligation to look after the people who enter their workplace, enter that space. That creates a whole other issue around customers, but we'll put that to one side for the moment. So as far as employees, the employer can say, there is a genuine risk of you contracting this disease. That's a debatable point in itself in Australia, but we'll just put it to the side for one moment. The vaccinations have been shown to reduce that, mitigate that risk. Therefore, we're going to require that all employees are vaccinated. So I guess just skipping back to the issue I alluded, what is the risk profile? There may be a little bit of argument around that. If I can jump across to an analogous process, drug testing, there are a number of cases where courts have looked at drug testing regimes, for example, in our work for an employer, where the employers had a mandatory drug testing threshold of, say, 0%, zero tolerance, as they often describe it. And the courts have said, well, that may be okay for someone exercising or operating a highly dangerous plant and equipment, but it can't necessarily be applied to the person who's sitting at reception. So the courts in this situation will be looking at questions of what is the risk to these employees? Are they employees who are predominantly working at home? If that's the case, then, and they're not seeing clients, they're largely working online, then what obligations what is the genuine risk factor there? And an employee could arguably say, if they're a software programmer or indeed one of our junior solicitors who's working predominantly at home, just working away on advices, which online, they could say, listen, I actually don't have dealings with anyone in a corporeal sense. All my dealings with people are purely digital, and therefore there is no risk. So that's one potential argument that an employees may have if employers are not thoughtful in the way they roll this out. All that may change within a few months when information on the second limb starts to come in a more official and forensic sense. And that is information as to whether this vaccine diminishes the likelihood of us communicating it to someone else. If we have that information, then employers have got even greater leverage to say, okay, you think that the risk is quite low for you, but you will from time to time be coming into the office or be dealing with clients, and we have an obligation to ensure their safety. So to that extent, that will give employers even greater leverage to say there is a genuine risk within the work and health and safety framework, and it's a risk to yourself and it's a risk to others if they are dealing with you and you don't have the vaccine. So that's your threshold for it. So what's the potential pushback from staff? The potential pushback, there's going to be some obvious ones which are a bit of a no-brainer for employers, and they will have to deal with this, and there may be some difficult adjustments to be made. At the moment, as I understand it, the vaccine is not being made available to pregnant women. So that may be a bit of a question. So this may arise, so it's not being made available to pregnant women, and it's not being made available to those, as I understand it, who have a recognised reaction to various, I think it's egg-based and various other based things, anaphylaxis. Anaphylaxis, thank you. That they are not being, the vaccination is not being provided to them. So they won't have that option. There may be some others. So what about someone else who says, I've got a medical, I'm medically compromised, I can't have the vaccine. Do you have to accept that? Or furthermore, they'd show up and say, I'm medically compromised. Here's a certificate from my GP saying I shouldn't have the vaccine. Is that enough? And the answer is no. Employers don't have to accept that. They actually have to come to their own view on that. Now, if it means that there is a GP who's provided me exhibit saying that Joy or Greg can't have the vaccine, then in those circumstances, they can be, the employer can get their own medical advice either based on the information, or they can send them off to be examined. So employers have to inform themselves in relation to the factors before they make a decision. And indeed, in such a circumstance, an employer can say, no, you actually have to attend. We have a rule. This is the reasoning behind it. It's sound reasoning. Unless you can provide substantive evidence to establish that you are an exception to this rule, you have to comply with it. So what then? What do you have if you've got people who haven't been vaccinated in an environment where the employers come to the view that all people have to be vaccinated? And I will step sideways here for a moment. Sometimes employers will not have that choice, because if, for example, you're running a catering company that does event catering, if indeed events still happen, but just assume for the argument that they do. And all those venues are saying, we are going to allow subcontractors to come into our premises if they've been vaccinated, then you're left with an employee who cannot do their job, essentially. That's where you, and the other example that arises from conversations we've had to this point is people who are consultants within your your nationwide business, where they have to jump on planes and they cannot jump on a plane anymore.
Yep.
It's just not financially viable. Someone catch the Indian Pacific to Perth to see some clients for a day and catch the train back. Arguably, unless they're going to do a lot of work on the train. But these are the questions. I think famously Kim Il-sung, the current North Korean, he doesn't catch a plane. I think
Kim
Jong-un.
Yeah,
Yes, he only travels by train.
Yes.
So not that he's a benchmark for
anything.
but be that as it may, so the question you'll then have to almost sift through, well, what are the key elements of that person's job description? Can they still do their job? And if they can't do their job, then the question arises, what are you then going to do? One option is simply to say, we have no work for you until you are vaccinated. So you can take annual leave. You're not technically sick. You can't sit off on sick leave. And when you're ready, you can return to the workplace. Or if clients arise that don't require vaccination, we will steer you into there, but we cannot pay you in the interim. Or you can take the further step of termination.
I'm just going to say, Warwick, we're going to run short of time.
I'm steering. I'm doing my best to get there.
Yeah.
You did pretty well, mate.
We've got a few questions bubbling up now.
Okay, let's go to them.
Yeah, so I was going to say, so Kath's got the first one and Carolyn's already got the discussion going, saying...
Okay, let's not forget Christine. We promised her first up.
Back to Christine. So let's just cover this one. What about women wanting to get pregnant, Warwick? What are your thoughts on that in terms of not wanting to have that discussion with their...
So I had a conversation with an Air Force lawyer because the military are mandating it to be pregnant, and between the conversations we had with the females that were there, everybody kind of went, pregnant women will be exempt, but what about those who are trying to conceive? And it was an interesting one because we'd all had kids and we don't want any more, but we did feel for the younger generation.
Yeah, I mean, good question. That'd be just dealt with by getting the appropriate advice to whether or not if people are vaccinated.
Medical advice.
Medical advice, sorry. Yeah. Medical advice as to whether or not people who are, and they may already be actively seeking to initiate that process, in which case they may or may not know at that point. So when you're saying you're trying to fall pregnant, it doesn't necessarily mean you haven't started that process.
Very good point. Well, just so we can cover off some questions from the floor, why don't we jump back to Christine and Chris?
Yeah, can I just touch on that for Kath for a second?
Yeah, sure.
The issue with the pregnancy, Kath, is that they actually don't do the clinical trials to include pregnant women and breastfeeding participants. That is always something that seems to come later in these clinical trials. So I think it's not totally off the table. In speaking with our medical law team, a lot of that comes down to the person providing the vaccine and the screening questions that they undertake leading into it.
Yeah.
So that's part of that discussion with your doctor as you go through that process.
Yeah. Well, so it's probably a good segue given your experience in insurance, Chris. Did you want to make comment? So, Christine, your original discussion or query was about us just exploring the insurance risk aspects a little bit more, I guess, in greater detail. And obviously, Matt and Jules from Anadili Aqua, I think they would be relevant to you guys as well, given that you've got staff travelling remote on a regular basis to interact with an Indigenous community. So, Chris, have you got additional thoughts to add?
Yeah, so Jen and I have looked at this from a workers' comp perspective. So there is coverage there workers' comp-wise if you were to contract COVID-19. Yeah. To take my solicitor hat off for a second and go back to being an insurance broker, for those who don't know, that's my past sins. The insurance broker part of me starts to think about your travel insurance policy.
Yeah.
what does that provide for you? Do you have any exclusions relating to pandemic border closures? So I think you do need a bit of a detailed discussion with your broker there to understand what you would be covered for, and also making sure that your employees are aware, those that are travelling, where they need to go and what they need to do in order to get help. So that's the quick one. There is a piece on public liability that needs to sit around that as well. I think you don't have a discussion on insurance without public liability. And we also talk about employment law there, probably in the reasonable management direction. Are you sending them into a place, a hotspot? I just know from a mining perspective, you know, what if you are travelling to Papua New Guinea? You know, there does need to be some serious consideration there in moving against, I guess, what government advice is.
Yeah, and I was going to say, to close the loop on that, Christine, look, we're happy to have a chat with you offline about that, maybe to take that on notice a little bit more and give it some more thought. But certainly I would say the relevant kind of worked example to think about in comparison is, look at what's happened now with the management liability lines in, what do you call it, officers and directors insurance, in terms of they're now being mandated effectively, you know, a legal clause if you provide insurance coverage within your existing management liability line in relation to penalties associated with work health and safety. The lesson there, I think, is what Chris is saying is you need to go back to your travel insurance, you need to go back to all your insurance policies and really read them with a fine-tooth comb and look for the specific wording and the exclusion. Is that a fair, fair summation? So if you're not familiar with them, get familiar with them and get, as we said in the insurance piece, get very familiar with your insurance broker and get them in the discussion now rather than in 12 months' time.
So that was part of your consultation process. And that was partly why we specifically included your insurance provider as someone that needs a seat on the table with this one, given what you might have going on in your organisation as it relates to employees and travelling and moving around, all the other things. What is going to happen to your insurance? So it's your travel insurance, it's your workers' comp insurance, what's going to happen to your premiums, what's in, what's out. What if you've got someone travelling internationally and then they're in another country and all of a sudden it's locked down? What will your insurance provider do for you in that case? So these are all the questions that you need to be asking of your providers.
And I think for the NT guys or the Queensland guys, that's probably particularly relevant with what's been going on in New Guinea this week as well. So look, I don't want to hog the floor. So look, we've probably got time for another 2 quick questions if anyone wants to fire away. And what we can also do is, if anyone's got more detailed questions, we're happy to take them on notice and have a chat between the three of us afterwards offline and come back to you. So if there's someone else that's got a burning issue, question they're just busting to get out that we haven't already covered? Matt?
No.
Yeah.
Okay, you've got
I'll jump in if nothing else says anything. Look, this is a really interesting topic for us because we're a Commonwealth Land Council. So we have employees that are employed through the Land Council, but then we also have our board that we report to with the CEO, and they have authoritative ability under, you know, for example, the Biosecurities Act that sits at the Commonwealth level. Yeah. So that's sort of one side of, I guess you would call it, the sandwich for us, and where the employees are the meat in the sandwich. And then the other side of another sector that we work with is the mining sector into our Aboriginal lands. So there's part of us, we're waiting for the mining sector to move on this to see if that influences our decision-making process. But then can we make the early move and passively put some sort of biosecurity provision in place that forces our employees to get vaccinated without bringing it down to an employment level requirement, basically a travel provision? You know, it's quite a detailed discussion, but I wouldn't mind opening that up for some thought just to get some early feedback.
Yeah, we can definitely take that on notice and come back to you offline, Matt. But so what you're saying for the other room is, could you look at trying to sort of catch all your employees using a biosecurity provision rather than needing to go to an employment law aspect? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's correct. You know, so if our traditional owners who all sit on the board through the Biosecurities Act and any provisions that sit in there around pandemics and COVID, the same way that we closed our borders through that act last year. I say the borders, I mean our Aboriginal land borders.
Yep.
And we also put some leverage provisions in place to say you're not welcome here on our land unless you're vaccinated. Basically.
No, so it's great question. And look, we might, we'll give that some thought and come back to you and certainly share any of the outcomes with the rest of the group more broadly. But look, thank you for that. That was a great one. Was there any final questions? Because look, obviously we can keep this conversation going via email or on the phone offline for anyone that thinks of something as soon as we jump off. But was there any other burning platform queries for anyone?
I think that probably if we think about this more broadly, one of the things that's going to be interesting to tackle is the people that interact with your workplace. And so this is going to be interesting to see how this evolves. So contractors that come to your workplace or that you engage, how are we directing them? Or what are we saying? You can't come to our workplace, you can't contract on our behalf if you're not vaccinated. You know, what is that going to mean for that sort of group of people? We know that contractors are workers under the WHS legislation. So how much influence and control can we have there? So that's probably another sort of subset issue. And I don't know if anyone's got any commentary on that, if anyone else has come across that issue. But that for me is one of the things that I think is worthwhile giving enormous amount of thought to.
What are your thoughts, Warren?
Just a couple of quick points I'll make. Just in relation to policies to be thinking about, there's obviously, you may well have vaccination policy already, which you may want to think through. Again, because this is a different issue regarding the vaccine. At the moment, it's only protecting the individual, as against the flu vaccine, which I understand actually diminishes the likelihood of other people getting it, and that may well change. Your sick leave policy, as an incentive, you, for example, may have a policy where someone who had the vaccine and contracted COVID but didn't have adequate sick leave, you would continue to pay them, give them the benefit of the doubt on that and actually provide paid sick leave. But for those who don't have the vaccine, you wouldn't extend the same courtesy. That's just an example of what you can do. Annual leave policy. If people are returning from overseas, God knows how they're going to get over there if they're not vaccinated. But if they're not vaccinated, you may decide that they actually have to take 14 days to sit at home before they can return to the workplace. Well, the government will continue to impose that. So they're going to have to deal with that issue. What sort of other incentives are going to be available for people who are vaccinated? If you want to think through that one. Travel policy, obviously we've talked about travelling interstate and how that's going to work. What sort of incentives you would provide to people who are vaccinated. Also, I guess, just the opportunities that generally are available to employees who are going to be vaccinated and what that will entitle them to do against those who are not going to be vaccinated and how that's going to play out.
Okay, great. Well, look, I really appreciate everyone's time, and we've run just a couple of minutes over, so we might leave it at that. But look, certainly wanted to say a big thank you to the Higsons Law guys for giving us their time today. Same to everyone in the room. Thank you for joining us and appreciate all the constructive debate and questions and queries. If you haven't already reviewed it, obviously, please give this a very serious read. And as Chris and Bron and I said at the outset, we're happy to consider any of those questions on notice to look at in more detail. Just lastly, just wrapping it up for next month. So same time again next month, we're going to be doing a similar panel discussion, but this time we'll be joined by our good friend and buddy, Rupert Evell from Singapore, who runs the Ethics Insight platform, so a software platform in the Asia Pacific, very specifically aimed at GCs and particularly big end of town businesses. We're going to be discussing the previously released discussion paper that we crafted with him earlier in the year. And so look, we'd love to have you guys share that widely and join or invite anyone more broadly in your organisations or colleagues in other organisations to join us on that one. It'll be a great one. It's all very relevant in terms of the aftermath of COVID, what's going to be the shift in the workplace environment around things like work from home, hybrid, whole bunch of stuff. It's really good. For those that haven't previously seen the paper or might have missed it, just drop us a line and we'll get you another copy of it if it's got lost in your constantly aggregating Google Mail chain. So, all right, well, look, thank you very much. Bron, did you want to?
Everyone.
Yeah.
And look, I've taken note of some of those really big ticket items that have been raised today, and we might try and schedule some catch-ups with some of you just to unpack them in a little bit more detail, particularly the issues, Caroline, around the contractors, parents, volunteers, Matt, around your biodiversity issue, and the girls from Kath and Caroline around insurance. So there's a few things there that we'd like to discuss in greater detail. So we'll come back to you individually. But yeah, next month, looking forward to talking about emerging risks for 2021, which will be the April discussion.
Legend. All right. Thanks again, guys.
Thanks, everyone. Good to see you all again.
Thank you.
Ciao. Bye.
Bye.